Okay, so we're here today with Matthew Holness, who's the writer and director of the new feature film Possum, which was adapted originally from a short story written for Comma Press for the new Uncanny anthology. So, Matthew, in terms of your short stories, did you come to writing short stories as a fan of horror fiction? Was that something that you were interested in before you kind of did those?
Yes, absolutely. And it was. I'd only written, I think, 2 or 3 before Possum, so it was still kind of, feeling my way about what kind of stuff I really wanted to write. But Possum was the first story, I guess, that I felt that I was sort of slightly proud of what I'd written in a way. It was the one I was kind of happy with, whereas previous stories that I had written, they were kind of I guess finding a way around it. But it was definitely love of horror fiction that wanted to get me writing. I grew up with obviously Stephen King, all those kinds of writers, but writers that really inspired me were people like Ramsey Campbell, and yeah, all great British horror writers really.
So would you say your influences on those stories were mainly sort of literary, horror fiction literary, or
Kind of a mixture really, in that I loved Stephen King. I loved all those books, and I read a lot of quite bad horror, which I really enjoyed. Obviously, from as a kind of serious reader, the more serious horror writers were ones that that really engaged with me on a kind of personal level. Those are the ones that really affected me in terms of the writing. But I kind of like my reading habits sort of veer between the serious stuff and pure plot-driven pulp. I quite like that as a reading experience as well.
and obviously it's a very long way from Garth Marenghi.
Yeah.
But in terms of Garth Marenghi being sort of about identifying horror cliches and sort of sending them up, was that almost useful that it's like you found the cliches and eliminated them and moved
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think it's quite fun. I find cliches fun, as awful as they are. They are quite educational, I think. I read tons of westerns, and what's interesting about reading pulp westerns is that you realise there's only about 7 basic western plots, and it's just really nice to kind of read stories that are doing variations on a theme and say, this is the ranch story, this is the revenge story, and there's something quite reassuring about picking up a book and going through those motions, I suppose. So, and I think enjoyment from that, I think, does teach you how plots work and how and why they work, and also why they don't every so often, and the kind of the cliches to avoid. So yes, it's quite a good educational process, I think, reading bad fiction as well as good fiction.
So in terms of the writing of Possum, I know the idea of that new Uncanny anthology was that you choose a theory from Freud.
Yeah.
So what was it about that theory about puppetry that kind of leapt out at you as there's a story here?
Well, I've always liked puppets in horror fiction, and it is, and maybe it's more cliched in horror films. I think the idea of a ventriloquist puppet. I suppose I've been reading a lot of fiction that did have puppets in them that I thought was really interesting. Stuff like Thomas Ligotti's fiction. There were always these very strange, creepy dolls and that. So that appealed to me. And the more fairy tale elements, the kind of Hoffman uncanny kind of stories with mannequins, all those sorts of things. So from a literary point of view, I found the idea of dummies and puppets and that interesting. In films, as I say, in films they're kind of dealt with slightly differently in horror films. It is very much the ventriloquist puppet that you kind of see more often. So I think it appealed to, in terms of writing the story, it was more that kind of literary horror puppet that was of interest to me, but I kind of like the idea of combining it with a fear of doubles, which also really I find very, very creepy, and the idea of a double that was also a puppet, a puppeteer that had made a complete his own twin that was not alive. That I found was an interesting way of kind of taking something that was fairly established in horror fiction, but maybe doing something that is a little bit different with it, and explore it in a slightly different way.
And in terms of when you came to make the film, I know you kind of fished around for different ideas, and you were thinking at one point of making a silent film.
Yes, I mean, I've been watching a lot of German horror films from the 1920s, expressionist films, and what I really liked about those films is that they were kind of all about war trauma really, and various other very very dark subjects and so the stories were not about that, but beneath the surface they all were, and they were a way of expressing a very real horror that no one could quite face up to at that point. So that was. So I found that were very, very interesting, and I love the idea of a silent horror film so much that I thought, is there any way that you could kind of do a modern silent horror film? And then that got me thinking that in Possum there was a character there that had suffered trauma and couldn't express it, couldn't articulate it, and constructed this horrific puppet as a way of confronting aspects of himself and aspects of that experience. And I thought, well, this is a character that wouldn't talk to anybody, wouldn't would keep very quiet, would only kind of talk to himself in his head, and would be constantly lying to himself, or trying to so that then made me feel that that's almost like the perfect character for a modern silent horror film, and that got me thinking along those lines. And as I say, the idea of puppets in horror films, I kind of knew that they were slightly cliched in a way, that there were lots of very, very good films that had done that ventriloquist puppet scenario, and so I wanted to do something a bit different with the film. So I felt that in all those films, the end of the film is where the puppeteer breaks down and suffers a nervous psychological breakdown. So I thought what would be interesting is that you pick the story up at that point. Right. To the point where they've broken down, and then they come home. What happens next? So that felt like a way of covering similar territory, but in a new way.
Okay. So did you actually go back and read the short story, or did you have it in your head and you just took a different take on it?
I think I may have reread it once, but I tried to I knew it had to change a bit, and I didn't want to feel too precious about aspects of it, because I knew it had to change to become a film. I knew it needed a greater sense of a ending. Really, it had to have a kind of confrontation. I was a little unhappy with the names. I think I only named one character in the story actually, because it was the same name as the serial killer Christie. I thought for a film it might it just felt like it was a little too confusing. So I sort of changed elements and rethought it a bit. But what I decided that I felt was important was to bring the subtext of the short story out more fully in the film, so that it's actually it's more kind of, that's what the horror is, and so it felt like that needed to be the brought forth as that kind of the dark heart of the piece, really.
Okay. Is it a horror film to you? Some people have seen it and said they don't think it is.
Yeah.
Did you sit down and think, I'm making a horror film?
Yeah, I did, to be honest. I've always kind of thought of it as a horror film, but not. There are horror films and there are horror films, and it's a psychological horror film. That's how I see it. It's interesting because I think you're right. Some people see it as like a thriller or something like that. I don't think it is a thriller. In fact, the elements that could be in there as a thriller are ones that I've deliberately sort of kept at a distance. Things like the police procedural element, all those sorts of things. So those were quite deliberately played down to focus more on Philip's headspace. Really, it's more for me a character study than it is a thriller in the more conventional sense, I guess.
Does it matter anyway? At the end of
the day, I don't think it matters at all. No, I don't think it does. There are lots of dark crime stories that you could just say are horror films, really. So no, I don't think it does matter really. Yeah.
So in terms of sort of where you go from here, are you interested in doing more fiction or more?
Both, really.
Okay.
Yeah, both. I'd love to write more stories, and also I'd like to make more horror films. So I've written a new script, which is currently in development. Which I think is actually darker than Possum, but we'll see. Hope to kind of move forward with that as soon as I can.
Okay. Would you be interested in writing a novel or a story? Is where it is for you?
It's interesting, kind of both. It's odd. I somehow don't feel I've got at the moment the stamina for a novel, and and I think it's possibly why I like the idea of writers so much, because I kind of envy their ability to kind of focus on a narrative and tap it out. I'm sort of good in short bursts, I think. I can kind of get a story done, and then I need to have a bit of a rest. So it's odd, I don't know. But I'd like to. But I think, but I'd also like to write a collection of stories. That would be quite a nice thing, I think. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm planning immediately.
How did you come to prose in the first? Was sounds between your first?
No, I wrote a story called The Heights, which was published in an anthology by Ash Tree Press, Canadian press, and that was like my first horror story. And then I also wrote another story called The Toad and I for Black Static, a genre magazine. But again, they were very much just early starting stories. I hadn't written anything before then really, so they're kind of, I wouldn't seek them out necessarily.
Did it at the time though? Did it surprise you how much you enjoyed prose? Did you kind of take to it?
Yeah, but it's hard. It was always hard work. Very hard work. I think. In all honesty, I find writing scripts easier, definitely. But I feel perhaps more proud of prose than script stuff I've written. I don't know. It's a different thing, really. It's odd. If I could hammer stuff out fast like a pulp writer, I'd be very happy. But it takes me ages to write stories.
So in terms of working within the horror genre, do you think the horror writers are trying to sort of control these sort of dark fears? Is it a conscious effort to try and get to grips with that stuff?
I think, yes and no. I think I doubt if writers sort of horror writers set themselves up to write a confessional. I don't think that's the intention, but I think that probably subconsciously they are writing about the things that bother them and the things about themselves, perhaps that they're not happy with, or they're not they're comfortable. It's odd because there are writers like you can take a writer like Sheridan of Fanu and it's only you can kind of read the biographical details of the writer's life, and then you're tempted to kind of seize upon parts of their life that you think, oh, well, maybe that informed this, and maybe and it's interesting because there's the story that always is told about Sheridan of Fanu, that they discovered him and he had this recurring nightmare that this tower or wall was going to drop on him, and the story is that the doctor came in the next day and Le Fanu was found with a terrified face and dead, and his doctor said, the wall fell at last, I think, or something like that. I don't know how true that is, but it's a good story anyway for a horror writer's end. But I think that it's tempting to read that, to read stuff reads into that, some kind of psychological. And it's like I suppose M.R. James as well. There's a tendency to look at that and go, well, what's really going on there? He's got a nice life, and what's actually going on? There probably is stuff going on, but maybe what that is, I have no idea. You know what I mean? But
and in terms of being a horror practitioner, if you were to start unpicking your process and thinking, would that be useful, or would that be totally counterproductive?
I think it would be counterproductive in a way, in that I like characters, and I like creating people with problems. It's like I think that's what writers do, whatever genre they work in. I think you have to be distanced from yourself to kind of write stuff. I think you have to, otherwise you're just writing a blog or something about how awful your month is or something like that. I think it's important that you have to create a world and you have to create a story, and you have all those elements in writing that are important. There's nothing worse than a story that doesn't get off the ground because the character's just philosophizing, and I think a good narrative is very, very important. I think writers they know that, and I think that is it's a nice mechanism to keep the whatever hell a writer's going through and they want to tap out. It's kind of nice to have it. It's a good way of controlling it. So I think there is that element of control. Certainly, there is. Whatever you're writing, there's a reason you're writing it. And maybe it's best that there are these things that kind of make it a safe way of expressing whatever you're really, whatever your subconscious is thinking about.
Could you say yourself you've ever actually found it cathartic?
No, I don't think I don't find it cathartic writing in that sense. I like if there is any element of catharsis, it's just the sense of the story's got a beginning, a middle, and an end, and I like the idea of having created something that kind of works. So I suppose that's the feeling I get most. But no, I don't. I've never written anything and sort of gone, oh thank God, I've got it done. It isn't. No, I haven't had that feeling really.
So how do you feel about Possum now? It's obviously getting very, very positive reviews.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, I'm sort of very pleasantly surprised because it was a difficult thing to write, just because it's so dark and kind of unpleasant. So it was a fun and very interesting exercise to a very specific brief when we were at the story stage. When it came to the film, it became, bringing out that dark subtext, it became very, a tough thing to write. So it was actually a script that when I handed it to my agent, I was, slightly half apologising for it as I handed it over. But I'm very pleased that the response has been very positive, and yeah, it's great. Yeah, I'm very, very, very pleased with how it's going down.
If the process of writing and making Possum was so difficult, is wanting to go darker next time an easy decision to make?
I suppose it's I've always been interested in horror films, and I like stuff that expresses very. I like stuff about very dark subject matter, and why I don't really know, but I like the honesty of it as a genre, and I like the fact that it kind of confronts things that I think it's important that you confront the things that really frighten you, and that you somehow express what is scaring you. And I think that I don't know whether that's because it's cathartic to do so. I imagine it is. It's interesting that there's a lot of talk about it being a boom in horror at the moment, and it all goes back to the Stephen King book Danse Macabre. When the world's in a really frightening place, you get all these horror stories and horror films, and people want to go and see them. People do want to kind of escape into them in a way, to kind of just I guess confront the stuff that's really bothering them. So I don't know, there is obviously some sort of compulsion for me to want to kind of write that stuff, and to explore that territory, but yeah, I enjoy it at the same time. I enjoy reading it as well, and I like a good ghost story is rewarding on a number of levels. It's rewarding on a purely technical level. There is, if you get a ghost story that really works, that it's a fantastic effect that it has, and I like that. But also in terms of psychological ghost stories, which I prefer, stories like Green Tea, for example, the Sheridan Le Fanu story. Writers like Sheridan Le Fanu, his stories you can read either way. They're either spirits from another place, or they are the human mind turning in on itself, and those things I find really fascinating. And I think anything that kind of deals with that, I just find very, very interesting. So. Yeah. And
for you personally, to sort of be heading into darker territory, would seem to be heading away from the comedy stuff. Yeah. Is that a definite? You don't want to kind of go back and forth?
Not really. No. I mean, it depends. It actually depends what mood I'm in. And in fact, just before Possum, I shot a short comedy film for Sky Arts, and it was really fun to do. And I worked with some people that I hadn't worked with since Dark Place, and that was really good fun. But I think there's a problem with doing comedy, that you're only seen as someone who does that. Yeah. And it's been taken a long time for me to kind of get established doing more serious stuff. And it is a balance, and I think that it's quite a difficult one to balance. And I think the more that you are seen to do comedy, the less, the harder it becomes to find opportunities to explore, more serious territory. So I don't know. It's at the moment, I think, as Possum's come out, and I'm very, pleased that it's out. And I think I'd rather concentrate on that side of things for now, definitely.
Well, look forward to whatever you end up to.
Thank you very much.